In the spring of 1942, the war in North Africa had already become one of the most unpredictable theaters of the Second World War. Across thousands of miles of desert, stretching from Libya to Egypt, armored columns moved like fleets across an ocean of sand. Supply lines were fragile, water was scarce, and survival depended as much on logistics as on courage. Yet for the German command, North Africa had become a stage for bold maneuver warfare and dramatic victories. The arrival of the German Africa Corps in 1941 had transformed the campaign. Sent initially as a small expeditionary force to support Italy's struggling army, it quickly evolved into one of the most formidable mobile forces of the war. At the center of its command stood a group of ambitious and highly trained officers who believed speed, surprise, and discipline could overcome the vast distances and harsh conditions of the desert. Among them was General Ludwig Cruwell. A professional officer of the old German army, Cruwell had spent decades studying armored warfare and command strategy. By the time he arrived in North Africa, he had already earned a reputation for being calm under pressure and methodical in battle. As a senior commander within the Africa Corps, he operated under the leadership of the famous Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, a man whose daring tactics had already begun to earn him the nickname the Desert Fox. Rommel's approach to warfare was unconventional. He pushed his forces forward rapidly, often beyond the comfort zone of traditional supply planning. His belief was simple: if the enemy was kept constantly off balance, victory could come before shortages became critical. This philosophy shaped the entire campaign in North Africa. German armored units struck unexpectedly, retreating only to strike again somewhere else along the vast front. But the desert was not empty. The British Empire had its own forces in the region, drawn from across the Commonwealth. British, Australian, New Zealand, South African, and Indian troops were all fighting to defend Egypt and the Suez Canal. For Britain, the canal was a lifeline connecting Europe to the Middle East and Asia. If Axis forces reached it, the consequences could be enormous. By early 1942, the struggle had intensified. German and Italian forces pushed eastward through Libya, while British forces attempted to halt their advance. The result was a series of fast-moving battles where control of territory could change within days. General Cruwell found himself deeply involved in planning and directing these operations. His responsibilities included coordinating armored movements, managing supply routes, and responding to British counterattacks. Command in the desert required constant attention. A single mistake could leave a division isolated in the sand, with no fuel and no reinforcements. Despite the harsh environment, many German officers believed they had the advantage. Their armored tactics were often more flexible than those of their opponents. German tank crews had extensive training, and communication between units was highly organized. Yet British intelligence was improving rapidly. Through reconnaissance flights, intercepted communications, and careful analysis of battlefield patterns, the British command began to anticipate some of the German movements. They studied how Rommel and his generals operated, learning where they were bold and where they were vulnerable. One of the greatest vulnerabilities in desert warfare was movement itself. Commanders frequently had to travel long distances between headquarters, observation points, and front-line units. These journeys were necessary, but they were also dangerous. On the 29th of May 1942, during one of the most intense phases of the campaign, General Ludwig Cruwell was traveling near the front lines. The desert fighting had entered a complicated stage where both sides were attempting to outmaneuver each other in a chaotic landscape of armored columns and shifting battle lines. Cruwell's staff car moved through the dusty terrain accompanied by only limited escort. It was not unusual. Senior commanders often needed to move quickly to maintain control over rapidly changing operations. But the fluid nature of the battlefield meant that enemy forces could appear unexpectedly.
British troops operating in the area had begun advancing through positions that were previously believed to be secure. Patrols were probing roads and supply routes, searching for opportunities to disrupt German command and logistics. At some point during this movement, Crewell's convoy encountered British forces. Accounts suggest that confusion played a major role. In the desert, identifying friendly and enemy units could be extremely difficult, especially when visibility was reduced by dust and heat haze. Within minutes, the situation had changed completely. General Ludwig Crewell, one of the senior commanders of the Africa Corps, was captured. For the British soldiers involved, the moment must have been astonishing. Capturing a general was rare. Capturing a commander directly involved in the operations of Rommel's army was even more remarkable. For Crewell himself, the experience was deeply unexpected. Only hours earlier, he had been coordinating movements of armored divisions across North Africa. Now he found himself a prisoner of war. The rules of war required that high-ranking officers be treated according to international conventions. Generals were not typically placed in ordinary prison camps alongside thousands of enlisted soldiers. Instead, they were often separated and housed in facilities designed specifically for officers. Still, the uncertainty was enormous. Crewell and other captured officers had spent years hearing rumors about enemy prison camps. Some believed they would be interrogated aggressively. Others expected harsh conditions far from the comforts they had known as senior commanders. The journey from the desert battlefield to British custody would take time. Prisoners were first moved through temporary holding areas before being transported out of the war zone. Eventually, many of the most important prisoners were transferred to Britain itself. For British intelligence, these prisoners represented more than just captured officers. They were potential sources of information about German strategy, internal disagreements, and the true state of the Axis war effort. But extracting useful intelligence from experienced generals was not easy. Officers like Crewell were trained to resist interrogation. They knew the rules of captivity and understood what information could be dangerous if revealed. British intelligence officers were already thinking about new ways to solve that problem. Meanwhile, the captured generals themselves were beginning to settle into an unfamiliar reality. The war in the desert continued without them. Battles raged across Libya and Egypt, tanks clashed in the sand, and Rommel continued his attempts to break British defenses. But for Ludwig Crewell, the battlefield was now far away. Soon he would be transported across the sea to Britain. There, in a quiet estate surrounded by trees and iron gates, he would live among other captured German generals. They believed they were simply prisoners of war. They had no idea that every conversation they were about to have would be quietly recorded, and that those recordings would remain one of the most unusual intelligence secrets of the entire war.
By the summer of 1942, the war in North Africa was still raging across the desert, but for a group of captured German officers, the battlefield had suddenly become very far away. After their capture, they were transported through a carefully organized chain of custody. First came temporary holding areas near the front, then guarded transfers through Allied-controlled ports, and finally a long journey across the sea toward Britain. For many of these officers, the journey itself was filled with uncertainty. They had spent years fighting the British Army, studying its tactics, and listening to rumors about what life in British captivity might be like. Some believed they would be interrogated constantly. Others assumed they would be kept under strict isolation, cut off from news of the war. But the British had something else in mind. Once they arrived in England, the captured generals were not sent to ordinary prisoner camps. Instead, they were taken to a quiet estate in the countryside north of London. The location was Trent Park, a large country house surrounded by wide lawns, wooded grounds, and iron gates that separated it from the outside world. At first glance, Trent Park did not look like a prison at all. The house had once been a private estate,
complete with elegant rooms, large windows, and carefully maintained gardens. Officers could walk the grounds, sit together in lounges, and even enjoy relatively comfortable meals compared to the harsh conditions of wartime Europe. To many of the prisoners, it seemed almost strangely civilized. British authorities understood that high-ranking officers required a different approach. Generals were accustomed to certain privileges, and maintaining those expectations could encourage them to relax. A relaxed prisoner was often less cautious. But the real purpose of Trent Park was hidden. Unbeknownst to the German officers, the entire building had been transformed into one of the most unusual intelligence operations of the war. Hidden behind walls, inside light fixtures, and beneath floorboards were dozens of carefully installed microphones. The rooms where the generals slept, ate, and talked together were quietly wired for sound. The system had been designed by British intelligence experts who believed that the most valuable information would not come from formal interrogations. Experienced officers like Ludwig Cruwell knew exactly how to handle questioning. They could remain silent or give carefully controlled answers. But conversations between fellow officers were different. When men believed they were speaking privately, they often said far more than they intended. Every word spoken inside Trent Park could be heard by a team of British listeners stationed in nearby rooms. These intelligence officers worked in shifts around the clock. Wearing headphones, they sat quietly beside recording equipment and typewriters, carefully listening to conversations unfolding in real time. When something important was said, it was immediately written down. Sometimes the conversations were mundane. Officers complained about food, discussed news reports, or speculated about the progress of the war. But at other times, the discussions became far more revealing. The generals talked about battles they had fought. They analyzed victories and defeats. They debated decisions of commanders, including those of Rommel himself. And because they believed they were among trusted colleagues, they spoke with remarkable honesty. For the British intelligence teams listening behind the walls, it was like opening a window directly into the thinking of the German High Command. General Ludwig Cruwell quickly became one of the many voices recorded within Trent Park. Like the others, he spent hours discussing the war with fellow officers. They shared stories from the North African campaign, argued over tactics, and tried to piece together what was happening on distant battlefields. Often they spoke about the difficulties of fighting in the desert. Fuel shortages, supply problems, and the constant pressure from British forces were frequent topics of conversation. Some officers defended Rommel's aggressive strategy, praising his boldness. Others quietly questioned whether his rapid advances had stretched their resources too thin. What made these conversations valuable was their spontaneity. There was no interrogation, no direct questioning. The officers simply talked. Sometimes the discussions drifted into surprisingly personal territory. Generals who had once commanded thousands of soldiers now found themselves with time to reflect on the war itself. They debated Germany's chances of victory, discussed political developments back home, and speculated about the future. Many of them had served in the German army for decades. They had witnessed the rise of the Nazi regime, the early victories of the war, and now the slow transformation of the conflict into something far more uncertain. The British listeners wrote everything down. Over time, thousands of pages of transcripts were produced. Each conversation was carefully translated, analyzed, and stored in intelligence files. The goal was not just to gather immediate military information, but also to understand the mindset of Germany's officer corps. How confident were they in their leadership? What did they really think about the progress of the war? And perhaps most importantly, what did they reveal when they believed no one else was listening? Inside Trent Park, the generals remained unaware of the operation surrounding them. They walked through hallways and gardens, completely unaware that microphones were hidden just a few inches away. In the evenings, they gathered in sitting rooms, smoking, drinking tea, and discussing the events that had shaped their careers. To them, it was simply the routine of captivity. They were prisoners waiting for the war to end. But every casual remark, every story, every criticism of strategy was quietly captured. For British intelligence, the operation was becoming one of the most valuable sources of insight into the German military. Yet there was also an irony that none of the prisoners could see. Many of these generals had spent years studying intelligence warfare. They had planned operations designed to deceive and outmaneuver their enemies. Some even joked about British intelligence, believing it to be clumsy or ineffective. And all the while, behind the walls of Trent Park, British listeners were calmly recording every word.
Inside Trent Park, life settled into a strange and quiet routine. The war that had once defined every hour of these officers' lives now continued somewhere far away, beyond the iron gates and tall trees surrounding the estate. For the German generals held there, days were filled with conversation, speculation, and reflection. They walked through the gardens, read newspapers approved by their captors, and spent long evenings discussing the conflict that had brought them all together. What they did not realize was that these conversations were becoming one of the most valuable intelligence sources of the entire war. Because the generals believed they were among trusted colleagues, they spoke freely. Rank still mattered among them, but the shared experience of captivity created a kind of informal atmosphere. Without the pressure of commanding troops or reporting to Berlin, many officers allowed themselves to speak with a level of honesty they might never have shown in official settings. British intelligence officers listening through hidden microphones quickly noticed how open the discussions became. The generals did not speak as if they were being questioned. They spoke as soldiers comparing memories, debating tactics, and trying to understand the larger direction of the war. One of the most frequent topics was the North African campaign. The officers who had fought under Rommel often revisited the battles in remarkable detail. They described tank maneuvers across the desert, the constant struggle for fuel and ammunition, and the unpredictable nature of desert warfare. Some praised Rommel's daring leadership. They described how his willingness to take risks had surprised British forces and allowed the Afrika Korps to achieve victories that seemed impossible on paper. His speed, his instinct for battlefield movement, and his ability to inspire soldiers were often mentioned with respect. But not every opinion was flattering. In the privacy of their conversations, some generals admitted that Rommel's aggressive style also carried serious dangers. Rapid advances often pushed German units far beyond secure supply lines. Fuel shortages became constant problems, and armored divisions sometimes found themselves dangerously exposed. These kinds of criticisms would rarely have been spoken openly during the campaign itself. Within the strict hierarchy of the German military, questioning a famous commander like Rommel could be risky. But inside Trent Park, with no subordinates and no official consequences, officers felt freer to speak their minds. British listeners took careful notes. The conversations also revealed something even more valuable than tactical analysis. They offered a glimpse into how the German military corps viewed the war as a whole. At times, the generals debated the strategic decisions coming from Berlin. Some expressed confidence that Germany could still win the war, especially if new weapons or successful campaigns changed the balance of power. Others were far more cautious. They discussed the growing strength of the United States after its entry into the conflict. They talked about the vast industrial capacity of the Allies and wondered whether Germany could realistically compete with such resources in the long run. These were not public speeches or official statements. They were private reflections spoken among men who had spent their lives in the military and now were watching the war from a distance. Occasionally, the conversations drifted toward the political leadership of Germany. The generals spoke about Adolf Hitler, about the influence of the Nazi Party, and about the complicated relationship between the army and the political leadership directing the war.
Some officers defended the leadership strongly, insisting that loyalty to the state was a fundamental duty of a soldier. Others spoke more cautiously, hinting at frustration with political interference in military planning. For the British intelligence teams, these moments were particularly important. They revealed tensions within the German command structure that were rarely visible from the outside. Another striking feature of the recordings was how casually the generals discussed events that to outside observers might have seemed extraordinary. Battles that had involved thousands of soldiers were described in calm, almost technical language. Victories were analyzed like chess moves. Defeats were dissected as problems of timing, logistics, or communication. Sometimes the officers even debated which side had made the better tactical decisions in particular engagements. They acknowledged occasions when British forces had surprised them or fought more effectively than expected. There was also humor, sometimes dark and sometimes ironic. Soldiers who had once commanded entire armies now joked about the strange comforts of their captivity. Compared to the hardships of the desert front, life at Trent Park could feel almost peaceful. They played chess, walked through the gardens, and discussed news reports about battles occurring thousands of miles away. All the while, microphones hidden in the walls continued capturing every word. As the months passed, the collection of transcripts grew larger and larger. Intelligence analysts began to notice patterns in the conversations. Certain officers were more outspoken than others. Some provided long and detailed recollections of operations. Others preferred to listen quietly before occasionally offering a sharp observation. General Ludwig Cruel was among those who frequently joined the discussions. Drawing on his experience commanding armored units in North Africa, he shared his views on the challenges of desert warfare and the complex relationship between speed and supply. Like many professional soldiers, he approached these conversations as technical discussions between experts. They were not trying to provide intelligence to the enemy, they were simply talking. But from the British perspective, these relaxed conversations were revealing more about the German war effort than any formal interrogation ever could. In London, intelligence officials reviewed the transcripts carefully. The material was not always immediately useful in a tactical sense, but it offered something deeper, a window into how Germany's military leadership thought, argued, and reflected on the war they were fighting. And yet the greatest irony remained hidden from the generals themselves. Inside Trent Park, they sometimes joked about British intelligence. Some believed the British relied too heavily on outdated methods. Others assumed that if the British wanted information, they would simply conduct direct interrogations. The idea that their own conversations were secretly being recorded never seemed to occur to them. For the men listening quietly behind the walls, that assumption made their work far easier. Because the most valuable intelligence often came not from questions, but from moments when people believed they were finally speaking in private.
As the war moved into its later years, the quiet operation inside Trent Park continued with remarkable patience. Day after day, British intelligence officers sat in small monitoring rooms, headphones pressed against their ears, listening to conversations that drifted through the walls of the old estate. What had begun as an experimental intelligence operation was now producing an extraordinary archive of first-hand insight into the German military. Yet the most surprising aspect of the operation was not what the generals said, but what Britain chose to do with the information. During the war itself, intelligence was one of the most carefully protected assets of any nation. Every secret had the potential to influence battles, save lives, or reveal hidden vulnerabilities. But the conversations recorded at Trent Park were rarely used directly in military planning. The British understood that the greatest value of the recordings lay not in immediate tactical details, but in the broader picture they created.
The transcripts revealed how German commanders thought, how they argued with one another, and how they interpreted the unfolding war. They showed doubts, disagreements, and moments of unexpected honesty that rarely appeared in official reports. Thousands of pages of these transcripts were typed, translated, and filed away in classified archives. Only a small circle of intelligence officers and analysts ever saw them. For the generals living inside Trent Park, the war continued to feel distant and uncertain. News reached them slowly through controlled newspapers and occasional rumors carried by new prisoners arriving from different fronts. Each new report sparked fresh debates in the lounges and gardens of the estate. They tried to piece together the direction of the war from fragments of information. Some believed Germany would find a way to regain the initiative. Others quietly suspected that the balance of power was shifting against them. But no matter what conclusions they reached, their discussions remained completely private, at least from their perspective. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world changed rapidly. Germany surrendered, Europe began rebuilding, and the focus of global politics shifted toward a new rivalry between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. The Cold War was beginning to take shape. Amid all these changes, the secret recordings from Trent Park remained locked away. There were several reasons for this secrecy. First, intelligence methods themselves were considered highly sensitive. The British government did not want to reveal that it had secretly recorded prisoners of war without their knowledge. Such a revelation might raise legal and diplomatic questions about the treatment of captured officers. Second, the transcripts contained extremely candid statements made by German generals. Many of these men would eventually return to civilian life in post-war Germany. Some even became involved in rebuilding the country's military institutions during the early years of the Cold War. Releasing the recordings too soon could have caused political embarrassment or controversy. As a result, the documents were quietly placed into classified archives. File boxes containing thousands of pages of transcripts were stored alongside countless other intelligence records from the war. Over time, they became part of the enormous historical collection maintained by British government archives. Years passed, then decades. Historians studying the Second World War wrote books about the campaigns in North Africa, the leadership of Rommel, and the strategies of the German High Command. They analyzed battle reports, official documents, and memoirs written by former commanders. But almost none of them knew that an entirely different kind of historical record existed. Inside the archives were conversations that had never been intended for publication. Unlike official reports or post-war memoirs, these recordings captured officers speaking spontaneously without the pressure to defend their reputations or justify their decisions. In many ways, they represented one of the most honest records of wartime thinking ever preserved. Yet the files remained hidden. The secrecy surrounding intelligence records was strict. Governments often kept sensitive wartime documents classified for decades, sometimes even longer. The Trent Park transcripts were treated in the same way. Gradually, however, policies began to change. As time passed and the individuals involved grew older or passed away, governments started to declassify more historical material. Archivists and historians began re-examining large collections of wartime records. It was during this slow process of declassification that researchers eventually rediscovered the Trent Park recordings. When historians first began reading the transcripts, they realized immediately that they had found something extraordinary. The documents revealed conversations between some of the most important German military figures of the war, captured at moments when they believed no one outside the room could hear them. These were not carefully written memoirs created years later. They were the raw voices of the war itself. The rediscovery of the recordings raised fascinating questions. What did these generals truly believe about the war? How honest had they been with one another? And how different were their private opinions from the public image they later presented? For decades, the existence of the recordings had remained almost completely unknown. Now, after more than half a century of silence, the voices captured inside Trent Park were about to change how historians understood the German officer corps and the inner conversations of the Second World War. The generals who had once walked through those quiet gardens never imagined that their words would one day be studied by future generations. They believed their conversations had vanished into the air. Instead, those words had been waiting patiently in the archives, preserved in thousands of pages of secret transcripts, ready to reveal a hidden chapter of history.
When historians finally began examining the Trent Park transcripts in detail, they quickly realized they were looking at something unlike any other historical source from the Second World War. These were not official military documents, carefully written to justify decisions or protect reputations. They were not memoirs written years later, shaped by hindsight and selective memory. They were conversations. Real voices captured in real time, spoken by men who believed their words would never leave the room. For decades, the image of the German officer corps had been shaped by a mixture of wartime propaganda, post-war testimony, and carefully written autobiographies. Many former officers portrayed themselves as professional soldiers who had simply followed orders while remaining distant from the political ideology of the Nazi regime. But the recordings from Trent Park offered something far more complicated. As historians read through thousands of pages of transcripts, they discovered officers speaking with remarkable honesty about battles, strategies, and sometimes even about the moral questions surrounding the war itself. Because the generals believed they were speaking privately among fellow officers, they often revealed opinions that would likely never have appeared in public statements. Some conversations confirmed what historians had long suspected. The German officer corps was not a unified group of identical thinkers. Inside Trent Park, disagreements were common. Some officers strongly defended the decisions of their commanders and the direction of the war. Others were far more critical, questioning the strategies that had led Germany into an increasingly difficult conflict. The discussions about the North African campaign were particularly revealing. Generals who had fought alongside Rommel analyzed their own operations with surprising detail. They described the strengths of German armored tactics, but also acknowledged serious problems that had affected their campaigns. Supply shortages were mentioned repeatedly. The vast distances of the desert had placed enormous pressure on logistics, and several officers admitted that rapid advances often stretched their resources beyond safe limits. Fuel, spare parts, and ammunition could take weeks to arrive across dangerous Mediterranean supply routes. In these conversations, Rommel was both praised and questioned. Many officers admired his boldness and his ability to move quickly across the desert battlefield, but others admitted that his aggressive style sometimes forced units into risky situations. Hearing these discussions gave historians a rare glimpse into how German commanders themselves evaluated their campaigns without the pressure to protect their reputations. But the recordings did more than reveal tactical debates. They also captured moments where the officers discussed the broader direction of the war. By the later years of the conflict, it was becoming increasingly clear that Germany faced enormous challenges. Allied industrial power was growing, new fronts had opened, and the war was expanding far beyond the expectations of its early years. Inside Trent Park, the generals tried to interpret these developments. Some believed that new strategies or technological breakthroughs might change the course of the war. Others quietly suggested that Germany had already reached a point where victory would be extremely difficult. These conversations showed a level of uncertainty that rarely appeared in official wartime statements.
One of the most striking aspects of the recordings was the tone of the discussions. Even when speaking about enormous battles involving thousands of soldiers, the officers often described events in calm, analytical language. For them, war was a profession they had spent their lives studying. But occasionally, more personal reflections appeared. Some generals spoke about the exhaustion of years of fighting. Others wondered what the future would look like after the war finally ended. For historians, these moments were particularly powerful. They revealed the human side of individuals who had once commanded vast military forces. At the same time, the recordings also forced scholars to confront uncomfortable questions. The conversations showed that many officers were aware of harsh realities surrounding the war, yet their discussions often remained focused primarily on military strategy rather than the wider human consequences. Understanding these attitudes helped historians build a more nuanced picture of the German military leadership during the war. As research continued, the Trent Park transcripts began appearing in academic studies and historical publications. Scholars analyzed the conversations to better understand how military decisions were made and how German officers interpreted the events unfolding around them. The recordings also revealed one of the most remarkable ironies of the entire story. Several of the generals had occasionally joked about British intelligence while living at Trent Park. Some assumed that British intelligence services relied mostly on formal interrogations. Others suggested that British intelligence services were not particularly sophisticated. They believed their conversations were completely private. In reality, every word had been quietly recorded by British listeners sitting just a few rooms away. For more than 60 years, those recordings remained hidden inside archives, waiting to be rediscovered. By the time they finally became known to historians, many of the men whose voices had been captured had already passed away. The quiet estate at Trent Park still exists today, its gardens and buildings looking much like they did during the war. Visitors walking through its halls might never imagine that the house once contained one of the most unusual intelligence operations in history. Within those walls, generals who had commanded armies spoke freely, believing they were beyond the reach of the battlefield and the ears of their enemies. But history has a way of preserving moments that people assume will disappear. The microphones hidden in Trent Park captured not only military secrets, but also the voices of men reflecting on one of the most devastating conflicts the world had ever seen. And decades later, those voices helped reveal a deeper, more complex understanding of the war, the commanders who fought it, and the quiet power of listening.